Welcome back to our fourth episode of a kind of a fast-paced road trip through the book of James. I'm leaving out a lot more than I'm including in order to whet your appetite for your own study of the letter and to that you can incorporate its teaching into your daily life. And remember, James is the one that said, if you don't do that, if you don't incorporate it, it's like looking in a mirror and doing nothing about the dirty face looking back at you. So what good is it to even have a mirror to begin with if that's the case? So we're going to cover just two verses in chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, where James says, those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. And this concept of being polluted by the world, usually when Christians think about the world polluting us, I think their minds turn to issues of private morality and what about social morality? I mean, there is more to living Christianly than avoiding sexual sin and bad language and drinking too much alcohol, right? I mean, the pollutants that we inhale every day from the world's atmosphere include toxins of like pride and power and greed and graft and injustice. And it's even more problematic when we supposed Christians exhale the same back into the atmosphere. So sometimes I give groups a 10-second test and ask them to write as many evidences of salvation as they can in rapid succession. And I've found that few people include any reference to how we treat the poor or to justice issues. Their lists mostly include stuff about private purity and rather than social responsibilities. And especially those with a more conservative bent to their ideology, their theology, their politics. But it's more sin management. In other words, they take great pains to keep it, like James said, keep a tight rein on their tongues, but they're okay with doling out great pain to other people, that have less power than they do. They might not smoke or chew or kiss girls who do, but they make very little difference in the world and have very little chance of leaving it a better place than the way they found it. By the way, there are a lot of Christians who don't even have that as a value to make the world a better place. I mean, somehow they've come to the conclusion that the best thing for the world is for the world just to fall apart so Jesus can come back and fix it. They rejoice over it getting darker and darker, and I just consider that a misshapen theology and, in my opinion, a lazy spirituality. But their idea seems to be the only way for us to improve the world is to lead people to Jesus. And now, don't get me wrong, I believe the best thing we can do for a person is to help them find Jesus and disciple them. But from my observation and paltry understanding of history, people coming to faith in Jesus sadly won't automatically impact the world positively. I mean, I get that from, most of the slave owners in the South were Christians, or at least they claim to be. And many or most of them believe that since Africans weren't entirely human, and since God intended for them to serve whites, it was okay with God if they treated them like animals. Due to their funky theology, I think most Christians in Nazi Germany, they put their stamp of approval on the genocide of the Jews and were complicit in the deaths of millions. European Christians traveled far and wide to kill Muslims who occupied the Holy Land, and on and on and on. My point is that just making converts, even genuine ones, doesn't necessarily improve the world. You might say, well, of course they need to be discipled. Right. I'm all about making disciples and not just converts. But the question is, who's doing the discipling, and how much of the discipler's faith is cultural rather than biblical? Because when faith is formed more by one's culture than by one's Bible interpreted through the revelation of the Spirit, the shape of the faith is going to look more like one's preferences than like Jesus, right? And so that leads me to James' statement here about real religion or true faith, an accurate expression of spirituality for which Jesus died. Real religion, according to James, is not only watching your mouth, but also watching out for people who need special help, like the least, last, and lost in the culture. Widows and orphans, he singles out. The Old Testament singles out widows, orphans, immigrants, and the poor. They're mentioned so often as a group that some people call them the quartet of the vulnerable. You know, today we might expand this quartet to include groups like refugees or migrant workers or single parents or the homeless or the unborn or victims of systemic injustice like people of color and LGBT people, etc. See, we're talking about people who for one reason or another represent the most vulnerable and those with the least agency in the culture. Isaiah says, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. Moses said in Deuteronomy 24, don't deprive the foreigner or the fatherless of justice or take the cloak of the widow as a pledge. And then in the list that follows in Isaiah's passage, the rest of the chapter, he speaks of idolaters. He speaks of people who lead blind people astray on the road. He speaks of people who have sex with animals and people who have sex with family members. So in other words, injustice is not in the greatest company in the Bible. So Jesus tells us that God judges societies by what they do at the bottom of society, Matthew 25. And like the prophets, James speaks of God's preferential treatment of the poor and the vulnerable, like I said last time. So let me conclude by saying this classless Christianity is it's not a one-way street where the wealthy and the powerful take care of the poor and the powerless who have nothing to offer in return. It's not like that. Real religion creates a community of mutuality out of every social, every ethnic, every gender and economic strata, where everyone is made of the same stuff and they have something to offer every other. In other words, like in Proverbs where it says, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. So everyone is made of iron, and it's not like there's one class of people that do all the sharpening and all the other classes who exist just to be sharpened. Everyone in every class has something to contribute to the sharpening of everyone else. You know, Martin Luther King Jr. said, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Well, let me stop there this time to keep it short. But you can find a more detailed treatment of these verses at soundcloud.com/musingthemysteries. Until next time.